She dropped to her knees, the fabric of her apron darkening where the coffee struck. People gasped, then stared, as if the sound of her fall had unplugged the city and everyone in the room had become a stopped photograph. He laughed. He lifted his phone, aiming for the perfect angle, and the laugh stretched, thin, entitled, across lacquered tabletops and polished chrome. He did not notice the man watching. The line in the headline read the way a judge bangs a gavel. Billionaire's son humiliates waitress. Didn't notice the Korean Mafia boss watching. For the patrons in the cafe, it was a spectacle. For the couple of social feeds, it was a punchline. And for the cameras outside, it was content. For Jin Woo, it was the first motion in a sequence he had seen play out far too often. Power enjoying itself while someone else paid. Jin was at the back, a small dark island in a room of glossy light. He sat with his palms wrapped around a paper cup, watching steam braid away. Phantom, his black Jindo, lay curled beside the booth, ears twitching at the high, brittle note of laughter. The dog's amber eyes reflected the glass and the white city beyond, unblinking as a clock. Jin did not look like someone who belonged to the kind of stories that made the news. His jacket was a practical thing, unremarkable wool, an ancient scuff at the elbow. His hands were calloused in a way that said work more than wealth. You could look at him and dismiss him as part of the furniture. That was the point. Alexander Wong made a show of leaning over the counter. He was young enough to have the lax arrogance of someone who had never been denied anything meaningful. His Italian silk shirt clung to him like status, cufflinks like punctuation. The phone camera caught the moment precisely. Coffee arcing, steam blooming, a paper napkin slapped onto a trembling hand. When Shayla, the waitress, crouched between the tables, people pivoted away as if their gaze would burn them. Alexander did not stop. He posted, he laughed. He wanted the world to know he could do anything and nothing would come of it. He didn't notice Jin. Jin did not intervene with fireworks or threats. He moved like someone who expected a chess game to be slow and dangerous. He watched the way Alexander's jaw worked when his father's name sat unspoken behind him. Victor Wong, the founder of Wong Industries, a company with more subsidiaries than most governments had ministries. Jin watched the security guard a table over, the subtle repositioning of the manager, the way the cafe's cameras tilted, recording the spectacle for an owner who would file it under incidents. He watched Shayla kneel and touch her forearm, where the fabric had fused to skin in a shallow burn. He watched her swallow a sound that might have been her dignity. When he stood, he did it the way a tide lifts a boat. He crossed the cafe without theatrics, speaking to Alexander in a low voice that did not rise to meet that laughter. "You make a mistake," Jin said. There was no question in the tone. It was a report. Alexander blinked, then sneered. "Who are you? Do you mind?" "Pay for what you broke," Jin said. "Pay for medical. Pay for time off. And you don't post it." A silence came then that was different from the shock a smartphone laugh produces. People leaned in, sensing the exchange. Alexander braced for spectacle. He expected to be mocked or shoved aside, to be filmed making another scene that would go viral. He did not expect the cigarette-thin calm in Jin's voice, nor the small black card Jin produced from inside his jacket. No logo, no bank name, only a matte, flint-dark rectangle that suggested resources without show. "Or what?" Alexander asked. His voice was theater again. He wanted audience. He sought escalation. Jin's answer was a gesture so casual it felt like a threat only because the man it was aimed at had never been required to pay consequences. "Or you and your father will learn what it is to have everything you built named and documented," he said. "You will learn that some things are far more fragile than your vanity." What followed was a social currency exchange. Jin slid the black card to the cafe manager and, quietly, Alexander was made to sign a paper. His name, his commitment to pay Shayla's bills, a promise that had the weight of small legal force, because in the signature he had admitted wrongdoing. It was enough to make Alexander storm out, a fuming child left to stomp his feet into a fashionably expensive night. It was enough to make him angry, and that anger, Jin knew, would not be the end of the story. As the crowd settled back into the small deforming gravitational pull of their own lives, the video hit the feeds and spread, but now with a new frame. Where a bully had been triumphant, a shadow had moved. Where a social moment might have been compressed into ironically captioned mockery, it would now ripple toward consequences. Jin watched the reaction on Shayla's face, confusion, relief, and a stress-etched understanding that the moment would follow her home. He watched Phantom's ears shift, the faithful dog a low pulse of calm at his side. If this resonates, consider subscribing. Shayla was 23, from a part of town where night shifts and overtime were currencies. She had a laugh that arrived like a surprise in otherwise thin rooms. She also had a sister, Kesha, 2 years younger, who had been missing for 6 months. Kesha had worked in a warehouse before she left. Kesha had filed a complaint about unsafe conditions. Kesha had vanished after she made a noise at a place that did not like to be noticed. That was how Shayla told it. An outline of fear and a list of silences. She lived in a studio with paint peeling at the window, night shifts washing the apartment in fluorescent light. Her phone was a cheap model that held family photos bowed into one another like pressed flowers. She slept with the volume low, always listening for someone who might call her name wrong and thus give it up. The cafe job was practical. Tips, partial hours, a manager who liked quiet people. Shayla did not speak about Kesha with melodrama. She spoke of deadlines missed, letters unanswered, a note she had found once under a sink that read like bureaucracy, written by someone who had never had to be kind. When Gene offered help beyond the check he had made Alexander sign, Shayla resisted the first time. She was cautious in the way people who have been ignored all their lives become, in protective increments. "I don't want trouble," she said. "I just want my sister back." Gene understood the economy of wanting. He told her only what he could do and what he would not promise. "I find things," he said. "Sometimes people help. Sometimes the truth goes public. Sometimes that fixes it. Sometimes it makes a mess." He did not offer hope as a cure. He offered a blueprint for action. Gene's life before the cafe had been a string of small corrective measures taken in dark rooms. He had come to the city with his family, hand-me-down suitcases, and a practicality that swelled into necessity. His father had died in a factory accident that the company labeled unfortunate and unavoidable. From that absence came a sharpened eye for how systems folded around the wealthy and left the rest like lint. He had learned slowly how to map influence, the way a bailiff's name led to a judge's nickname, the trace that a shipping receipt left back to a CFO's habit of signing in the 3rd week of each month. He had built a network that offered protection for those left out of the net, not in the movie's glamorized way, but with a grim ledger of favors and debts. Lawyers who took a small fee, drivers who remembered faces, a doctor willing to sign a note for a worker who had been injured. People called him many things in the dark. Most of them were scared to call him at all. Gene called what he did protection, and he kept it pragmatic. He also kept Phantom. The dog was no accessory. Jindos are an ancient breed. Phantom's body was an instrument tuned to silence. The dog seemed to know things before they happened. When the city would deliver anger, when a vehicle was too loud, when a knock was a threat. To sitting strangers, Phantom was a handsome mutt. To those who had been watched, he was a reason to breathe. Gene's first move after the cafe was an inventory. He wrote down names. He listened to the frequency of Alexander's laughter. He listened to the manager's nervous explanations about insurance. He watched surveillance footage, carefully, not because he intended to publish it, because in it were things people missed when they were drunk on status. License plates, cleaning schedules, who had access to a basement elevator. He took photos with a slow finger, not to boast, but to collect the scaffolding of a problem. Melissa Chun worked with screens and patience. She had been a reporter long enough to have her own scars. Threatened libel suits, a retracted piece that had been cleaned up by legal counsel at 5 in the morning, a friend in the newsroom who still answered phones from handcuffs. Melissa and Gene knew one another by degrees. They had crossed paths at a pitying charity gala, and again at the back of a courtroom where she had watched a sleeping witness break down under counsel. She did not expect miracles from Gene, and Gene did not expect absolution from her. They both worked in the business of naming things. Melissa came to the cafe the next day. She had eyes that missed nothing, and a bag of notebooks in which she kept her sources' names like fossils. She sat with Gene in the corner, and they spoke in a language without flourish. "Debt," she said, flipping a page. "Power. Cover-ups." Gene slid photos across the table, an internal compliance ledger with a column strangely empty, names replaced with initials and vague contract numbers that led to shell companies. There were wires marked vendor that looped through accounts with no procurement paperwork. There was a document, stamped in a corporate gray only someone who had filed FOIA requests would recognize, that read, "Employee IDs to be held in custody for client convenience." "You sure these aren't misfiled?" Melissa asked. Her face was an instrument measuring risk. "They're not misfiled," Gene said. "They're kept." There are wages that don't show up. There are names crossed out. He tapped a photo of a ledger where a line had been underlined in blue ink. And people who leave don't get checks. There's a wage gap on purpose. There are complaints that end up in file drawers. Melissa's pen stopped. If this is real, if it ties to warehouses, then we're looking at more than negligence. She said the words quietly. We're looking at organized labor abuse. You have to be careful, Jean said. You publish wrong, they bury you. You don't publish wrong. You publish with witnesses and names, Melissa replied. You publish with people who can say, under oath, what they saw. She looked at Shayla, who had come and sat quietly at a booth and listened. Do you have anyone who will speak? Shayla swallowed. She thought of Kesha's brittle smile, of the last Instagram she'd posted, blurred, a hand, a hallway. There were girls who were scared, she said. They were told if they spoke they would be deported, or their families would be punished. Kesha told me she saw a van, and she wrote a note. That's all I have. Jean and Melissa worked the next phase like two halves of a plan. Jean's network knocked on doors in the dark and made quiet queries that had nothing to do with newspaper headlines. It had to do with placing trust as one places stones when crossing a river. Melissa used her press credentials to pressure for records. She called a lawyer who owed her after a small but telling favor a year back. She fed subpoenas into the system that were unlikely to be honored quickly, but would show up in the paper trail. Jean bought time and movement with cash and knowledge, a temporary phone for Kesha's sister, a small trust for immediate medical attention. He did not tell Shayla everything he could do. He told her what she could handle, that he would try. The breakthrough came through the Ledger's trace, a shipping company with a name so bland it was invisible, Northbridge Logistics, owned on paper by a front in another state. A search showed leased warehouses without public employee rosters and shipments arriving at odd hours. There were payroll entries that paid cash for contract labor and deductions for housing and meals that eliminated net pay. The records were not open admissions of crime, they were the ellipse around it. But they pointed to a warehouse on the industrial edge of town where the lights were rarely bright and the trucks came in at dawn or dusk, times when the city's eyes were half closed. Jean did not storm the place with a camera crew. He watched how a truck arrived and left, how a guard clocked in, the pattern of a building that kept its mouth shut. He took a snapshot of a loading manifest, a blurry photo of a door with a peeled sticker that read something like, Private Access. He filed the photos quietly. He asked a woman sweeping a doorway about the people she saw. She would not speak at first. Fear is a language learned in the thin rooms. But later she left a note where she thought someone would find it. They take our papers. They sleep upstairs. They are scared. The note had the blunt grammar of someone who had never been given time to be precise. Jean assembled a small team, drivers who owed him favors, a nurse who would volunteer to take in those who had been hurt, and a translator who could coax names from mouths that had been practicing silence. They were not a militia. They were a series of people who, for their own reasons, guilt, gratitude, a quiet sense of alignment, would do what needed doing. Jean would not pretend it was anything less complicated than necessity plus risk. Inside the warehouse the air smelled of oil and metal and the ghost of chemical cleaners. There were rows of bunks in a dim space, cots pushed close until people slept with their elbows in others' ribs. There were bags piled in corners, shoes lined in a neat, desperate order. Jean found identity cards, thin plastic with faces that had been cropped to remove names, and pay stubs with numbers that only made sense if someone was subtracting more than they should. The workers were not chained. They were held by fear and by the economics of having a passport withheld and a wage subtracted until moving seemed impossible. Jean's hand hovered over a note someone had left, a scrap of paper with a number scrawled and then crossed out. Then, in a corner under a thin blanket, Jean saw a face he had already memorized from a rolled photograph Shayla had shown him. Kesha. Her hair was shorter. Her eyes had an edge to them that comes from being alive and having someone try to take away your future. She looked at Jean with a combination of recognition and the long weariness of having been counted out too many times. They did not have a movie's rescue, no dramatic chains broken at midnight, but they had what was necessary. People moved in quiet, in the way of those who do not want to wake the building into alarm. A doctor humming a useless lullaby, a translator speaking names like prayers, a van humming and taking the small bodies away to a motel where they could sleep and call whoever they needed. Kesha's first words to Shayla were not breathless relief, but a terse string of logistic questions. "Did you find me?" Shayla asked. Kesha touched her sister's hand, and, in the touch, all the months of space shrank. Melissa was waiting outside in a car that smelled faintly of coffee and old newspapers. She had spending to do, and a lawyer on retainer for the piece she had been drafting. There were images on the thumb drive she kept beneath her seat, ledgers that matched what Jean had handed her, witness statements transcribed and signed, Keisha's phone photos of uniforms and stacked bunk beds. The material was damning in the way that architecture is damning, small, solid nodes forming the outline of a crime. Publishing was not instinct for Melissa. It was a calculus. She lifted the files to her editor, then to the copy desk, then to the legal department. She expected pushback. Corporate would call with lawyers whose voices were designed to command compliance. They would threaten and ask for corrections. She had prepared by dressing her story in verification, a sworn affidavit from a worker, payroll copies, a bank trace, Keisha's testimony. She was not naive. She knew powerful men had resources that could bury narrative, and she had seen reporters lose faith before the presses cooled. She also knew what happened when a paper had both documentation and the moral momentum to sustain a story. The market responded quickly to narratives that could stick. When Melissa's story hit the front page, Wong Industries under scrutiny, documents suggest forced labor in supply chain. The city felt it like a distant thunder. The website lit up, then the feeds. The article threaded anonymous testimony with the paper trail. Names of shell companies, the ledger lines showing payroll deductions for housing, the photographs of the warehouse bunks. It did not use lurid adjectives. It used names and documents and a photograph of Keisha, eyes hard but steady. It linked Alexander's video, not as a punchline, but as an example of a culture of impunity. The story gave the public a discrete mechanism to be outraged without being credulous. The math lined up. Corporate response was a separate choreography. A statement released by Wong Industries called "The Allegations Unverified" and promised cooperation with investigators. The phrasing was jewel-like, careful, lawyered, and designed to float. Alexander posted a video apology that read like a PR script. Regret framed in 3 seconds, then a pivot to philanthropy. But markets have teeth. The company's stock wobbled in after-hours trading. Institutional investors called for audits. Social feeds that had once laughed at the café now clucked in condemnation. The domino of public accountability, once nudged, toppled faster than most men expect. Victor Wong watched the story from a penthouse with glass that looked like the city itself. He did not shout. He simply made a call to a man who wore a tie the color of emergency and asked in measured terms who had failed him. Victor's language was precise because he had spent a life shaping things in precise lines. Donations that bent public attention, legal teams that could bury stories in obfuscation, favors stored neatly in binders. He had not built a system that liked to be audited without the consent of its architect. For Jean, the public fallout was a usable noise. It extracted leverage from the gilded cage. It forced corners of the world that had once been bedrock to wiggle. For Shayla and Kesha, it was a thunderclap and a mercy all at once. There were calls from social services, arrangements for transitional housing, offers from nonprofit lawyers who did not mind the press. Melissa coordinated interviews. In court transcripts that would later be read like a map of collapse, a worker's voice would first be present because a journalist had given it the shelter of publication. But the city does not forgive easily the ones who wake certain bees. A story that touches a head of a hydra will make that hydra jerk. A leak becomes an accusation, then an indictment, then an act of retaliation. Small men in large houses do not like to have their humility stripped away in public. Alexander's father did not merely write a rebuttal. He recalibrated. Jean had expected the retort to arrive. Sometimes it came in smear campaigns, sometimes in quiet extortion, sometimes in flames that ate a building's facade. He did not romanticize it. He prepared as one does for a storm, charts in his head of who might act and what they might lose. He called a lawyer friend in the morning and covered places where witnesses slept. He arranged for Keisha and others to be moved from safe house to safe house while the legal machine began its slow work. He kept one hand in the visible world and the other in the shadow corridors that had no headlines. Alexander, when he learned that his father's world was wobbling, felt something new. He sat in a panic room he had used before as a joke. People paid to feel secure and paid more to feel untouchable. He called counsel. He called PR. He called the men above him who kept him boyishly defended. The videos he had made were now not just amusement. They were material. The managers who had laughed at the cafe were reconsidering their smiles. That night, Sky News ran Melissa's interview. Keisha on camera, voice steady, describing a day in a warehouse as if it were a weather report. Factual, necessary. A photo of Alexander at the café ran beside the piece. In the shadows of a hotel bar, a man tapped a screen and watched the stock ticker wind downwards. There are moments when a man learns that the scaffolding he built can be dismantled without the force he imagined he would need. Victor Wong, from the glassed-in height of his world, saw a pattern of filings and calls and understood that the city had learned his company's skeletons. Jean sat alone in another café after watching the feeds. Phantom lay at his feet, breathing slow. He had not done anything yet that would carry him to prison or to glory. He had done what he could, found the missing, handed facts to the light, and made certain men taste the ash of public exposure. But the thing he knew was the vulnerability of momentum. Once the world saw, it demanded a follow-through. That follow-through often required more than documents. His phone chimed, a single vibration against the table. Melissa's name filled the screen. "It's live," she said, voice low but steady. "They're calling for hearings. The SEC just opened an inquiry. Investors are circling. We have to keep witnesses safe." He looked up at the people who came and went, dressed in evening clothes, in uniforms, in the ordinary armor of living. A group of teenagers laughed a rowdy laugh near the door. A woman on her laptop scrolled with the casual brutality of the internet. The world churned. Jean thought of Shayla in her thin apartment, of Kesha awake somewhere with the hard line of someone who had been through danger and returned. He thought of the cafes, the warehouses, the ledger lines that add up to an economy. He thought of what it cost to make sure the vulnerable were not invisible any longer. Someone was watching back. The question was what they would do with the knowledge. He closed his phone and watched Phantom, whose head lifted and fixed on a point at the window. Outside, the city lights smeared on glass like oil. In a corner of his vision, the headline still hung, "Billionaire's son humiliates waitress." For now, the spectacle had been reframed as an entry in an irritant file. For now, the public had rallied. The machines of justice had begun to turn. But things that turn toward accountability often provoke a reflex. In the architecture of power, there are men who will use their very best resources to fight quiet. Victor Wong did not yet threaten. He was the kind of man who would map out retribution as an insurance exercise, a spreadsheet. He would not admit anger. He would strategize. The first moves were subtle. Calls to board members, stories seeded to friendly outlets, questions whispered about Melissa's sources. There would be men in suits and women in reserved roles who would be asked to do unpleasant favors. Jean understood this pattern. He also understood another, that exposure made men move imprudently. He could see Alexander's impatience in the 2-week-old photograph of him posted online, his grin cracking. He could see Victor's calculated cool in the way the company's statement used the word cooperate. He could sense the shift in the city's air, quiet, like the tightening before a storm. There would be costs, he knew. There would be things he could not fix with a card and a signature. There would be a decision to make, not a dramatic one, but a moral inventory. How far to go to keep people alive, and how much of himself to risk in the process. He had walked this line before. He had paid a price, and so had those who worked with him. Protection is not free. It is paid in favors, in bad nights, in the occasional collateral consequence that will sit inside a man's ribs and do the slow work of changing him. That night, a man in a luxury suit who worked for the company from across the river raised a glass in a room that smelled of cedar and money. He called a number that reached a woman with quick answers and slower muscles. He asked for a favor without saying the word. "We need to make people stop looking," he said. "We need to remind them of what they have to lose." Words like that travel fast. They find the people who prefer others to sleep. They sit heavy beneath the pavement. Jean had seen men like that. Men who sent warnings in envelopes, who hired thugs to frighten a witness away, who burned a car because the message needed a visual. He did not expect all that, and he did not want to pretend it was the only route. He preferred leverage, not bloodshed. But leverage is a brittle thing when a man's back is against the wall and his resources are expansive. On the street below his apartment, someone chalked an alley with a protest stencil. Voices passed like quick birds. Melissa called a contact at the federal office and arranged for prosecutors to see the documents. She did not mention Jean's name, choosing instead the safe harbor of verification. Jean stayed in the gray between the press and the law, the place his kind of work usually lived, useful to both, mistrusted by many. He did not sleep well. Phantom kept watch by the door. At dawn, a photo came across his line, Alexander in a suit, looking smaller than he had in the café, eyes ringed by a night of bad dream. The caption under the image read like an accusation. He didn't notice who was watching. Jean let the phrase sit in his mind like a stone in a shoe. He had made himself visible when he had to, but he had not wanted the world to make him a symbol. He had wanted, more simply, to return Kesha to her sister, and to make sure no one could so carelessly smash a person's dignity for a laugh. The city was waking into a new day. The pieces were moving. There would be more noise. Jean burned a cigarette once the city privacy allowed and watched the smoke pull skyward. He thought of the ledger entries he had photographed, the workers whose faces had become the truth of a story, and of the black card he had used as a surgical nudge in a place that favored blunt force. He thought of the cost. Then his phone buzzed again. The message was short and sent from an unknown number. "We see you." There was no flourish, no threat, just a line that acknowledged observation. Jean read it twice. Then before he could consider reaction, a second message arrived. "They are getting nervous." Jean folded the phone closed and slid it into his jacket. Phantom rose and padded to the door, tail a low curve of attention. The city outside had not yet decided whether it would clap or roast the men at its heights. What it had decided, imperceptibly, was that someone had opened a door that had been kept tightly closed. For better or worse, everything that followed would walk through that doorway. He stood, paid for his coffee, cash this time, and walked out into a morning that smelled of rain and hot asphalt. He did not hurry. The pace had to be steady. The scale of what lay ahead was not for the quick-handed. It required patience and a capacity to be ugly in ways the law did not like while still leaving a path back to light. As he passed the cafe window, he saw Shayla standing across the street, wrapped in a coat that did not belong to wealth but to gratitude. She looked at him and then at Kesha, who stood beside her now, holding a small paper cup like a trophy of survival. Their eyes met. It was a soft thing. Thanks, relief, and a suspicion that this was not over. Jean nodded once. He thought of the ledger lines and the press and Victor Wong's penthouse. He thought of the men with cedar-scented rooms who made favors into instruments. He thought of the city's appetite for spectacle and its impatient need for justice. He thought of how one public humiliation had evolved into something larger, a fracture, careful and dangerous, in a system assumed to be unbreakable. Behind him, the cafe's front window reflected a city moving into afternoon. The headline flashed in the corner of his mind as if a page had been folded and unfolded. Billionaire's son humiliates waitress. Didn't notice the Korean Mafia boss watching. The sentence had started a chain. He had watched it begin. What he did next would not be clean. It would not be entirely lawful. It would be necessary, he told himself, in the way a surgeon tells a fearful family that the operation will hurt, but it will save the patient. He kept that statement private because the people who favored his methods needed the luxury of not being invited into his conscience. He walked toward the river, Phantom at his heels, and to the first small office where the city's hidden ledger of favors was kept. A table overturned on a cheap floor, a man sleeping with his mouth slightly open, a bag with the night's take. There he would begin to map the retaliatory moves. There he would place the pieces that might make the Wongs feel cost. There he would prepare to do what he had to do so the next morning, when the world peaked in its customary way, it would find that the story had teeth. Newsrooms were already buzzing. Melissa's editor called with a new request, more witnesses, voice recordings if possible, and any internal memos that demonstrated a coordinated pattern rather than isolated mismanagement. Jean gave them what he had and promised to look for more. He also promised himself something more private, that he would not let this become a crusade that chewed him up. He had made that mistake in the past. It had cost people dear. Protecting the vulnerable had edges sharp enough to bleed. He would be careful. He would be precise. The city's day went on, oblivious to the gears that had begun to grind. A child on a scooter rang his bell. A delivery man cursed under his breath. A politician walked briskly past a camera without slipping on his smile. In the distance, Victor Wong's office windows threw back the sun like a mirror. In the small interiors where the rescued slept, someone cried for the first time in months. Kesha sat on the edge of a bed and watched Shayla sleep. She touched the patch of skin where the coffee had landed and felt the memory in a way that was more than physical. Jean found himself at the edge of the river, watching the city reflect itself in compressed slices. He had turned a spectacle into a campaign. The campaign had just become public. For a second the air tasted like possibility. Then the message on his phone shuffled in like a second drumbeat. His contact list lit for a handful of names, people he trusted and people he had used. The line between the two had always been brittle. Tonight it would be tested. He had destabilized a man of consequence. That achievement was something to file under necessary, but it was not an ending. It was a beginning. The newspapers had done what they do, named the wound. Now the city would watch to see what came out of that wound, healing or infection. Jean looked at Phantom, whose eyes were a constant, unreadable light. He felt the old hunger in his chest, the one that had come when his father's name had been written off by a company memo, when his mother had packed a suitcase and they had crossed a river to a place where their names were new. That hunger had not softened. It had simply learned to be surgical. He turned his phone back on. There were more messages, some from volunteers asking how to help, some from lawyers assessing the document chain, and one that simply read, "They will come for the witnesses." The message was short, neutral, and it lived at the place where the city's various dangers gathered. Jean did not move like a man. Jean did not move like a man surprised into action. He moved with the economy of someone who had rehearsed the worst and budgeted for it. The messages, thin, clinical, kept arriving, warnings, veiled threats, false offers of truce. They were the sounds a city makes when power notices a wound. He catalogued them, folded them into the ledger in his head, and assigned probabilities. He did not flinch. He planned. Retaliation began as a message sent in the night. A burned delivery van was found on an industrial road at dawn, its tires melted into black lace. The driver escaped, dazed, but the van had been carrying supplies for one of the safe houses. The fire was careful, meant to frighten, not to leave a body to identify. Jean visited the smoldering metal and ran a finger along a heat-blackened bolt, feeling the stupid arrogance of whoever had staged it. The message was clear: stop pulling threads. A week later, a courier who owed a debt to Jean, a wiry man with 2 missing molars and a fondness for cheap whiskey, did not show for a drop. His phone went to voicemail. Jean and a few people who had once worked with him found his apartment door ajar. He had been beaten and left for the undertow of the city's indifferent night. The legal system took its time. The hospital took the immediate bills. Jean paid. He logged guilt like a ledger entry and turned it into strategy. Protection took casualties. The math was bitter. Melissa's expose had opened agency doors, but it had done more than that. It shifted the Wongs from smug denials into counterattack. The company employed whisper campaigns to discredit victims. Friendly columnists called for balanced reporting. Anonymous tips to federal offices suggested Melissa's sources might be compromised. The pattern was as old as corporate defense: drown the accusers in process and time. It worked enough to slow a few threads, and every delay cost someone a night of safety. And then Shayla was attacked. She had been careful, more careful than most of the people Jean protected, but caution is not armor. The first time they found her, she had been making coffee in her tiny kitchen. A man had forced his way in, a brute who moved like whatever story he had been told made him entitled. He had demanded money, then said words that left a bruise on the soul before he left. Once was bad enough. Twice was worse. The second time they found her unconscious in her bathtub, a syringe discarded beside the tub. Hospital lights folded her face into a map of bruises. She slipped into a coma that smelled of antiseptic and syrup, a body caught between trembling hope and an engineered silence. When Jean saw her in the ICU, pale under a nightlight of monitors, he felt the angle of his mission change. The legal process could wait. The immediate was the immediate. Melissa's story had forced sunlight, and sunlight was what had made the predators angry. That anger would be precise, and it would land where the defenders could not always protect. The cost had become personal. He gathered his people, and they worked like technicians in a failing system. Lawyers who moved with documents, medics who could suture a field wound and a life, a social worker who could coax a family into staying. He hired a counselor who specialized in trauma-informed care, and a private nurse who could live at a bedside. Money bought privacy and speed. It could not unmake what had been done. It could only create a chance. In the meantime, the Wongs escalated in a new register. Victor moved his money into internal security contracts. Board members were silenced with non-disclosure pacts and new assurance portfolios. Lawyers filed suits alleging Jonathan and Melissa had colluded to defame a Fortune 500 firm. The company announced an internal review while moving evidence into controlled vaults. The SEC's early inquiries were promising theater for the market, but Jean knew the difference between theater and traction. Public attention could be a shield. It could also be a leash. Gene shifted his hand. He had built leverage from data and exposure. He now needed leverage that would force action without costing more lives. He moved against the architecture that had protected Victor for decades. The shell companies and front accounts, the shadow contractors who supplied unmarked vans and sublet floors. He did not burn things down outright. He removed options. He did not believe every problem cleaned itself by force. Sometimes it was smarter to take away the tools. The first true blow to the Wong machine came not in a headline, but in a bank ledger. Gene's team, small, disciplined, traced payments that had been laundered through contractors that did nothing more than sign receipts. He used people who had been inside the system, an accountant who had once sold his silence for fear, an IT contractor who had left fingerprints on a server. They were the type who had been kept docile by the assumption that their boss's money was a wall. Gene did not blow the wall. He undermined its foundations. He gave Melissa a set of bank transfers that had been made in rounds, payments for facility maintenance, wired to a company that had no staff and no lease. They matched shipping manifests and dates of missing payroll. They matched the names of men who had visited the warehouses in the dead hours. Melissa ran them. Her editor ran them again. The paper's computer system whirred and printed out another front page. This time the reaction was quicker. Regulators announced formal inquiries. Investors began to ask questions at board meetings, and those questions were followed by compliance officers who asked harder questions about where payroll was routed and why certain teams were outsourced to companies with names that smelled like fog. Victor's empire, which had once seemed monolithic, developed a taste for fissures. The stock wavered. Hedge funds called for emergency reviews. The company's PR machine shifted into salvage mode. Inside the building, panic is a precise thing. People stop taking the small pleasures of entitlement because they can feel the bite of consequences in their collars. Alexander discovered it all at once. He woke to find the nightclub that had given him a private corner, now replete with reporters. He learned that his social feeds were being parsed and his jokes were being used as evidence of a culture. He learned that the man he had humiliated had been more than a coffee buyer. He learned the price of being viral in the wrong way. Victor, on the other hand, did not rage. He counted options like chips. He reached for old favors and found many had been spent. A senator who had been paid in donations had left office. An ex-executive who had once been willing to lie had become inconveniently truthful. He was a man who had always had time. Gene had stolen that time. He had made it move like an urgent pulse. Victor called in his oldest instrument, control through fear. He ordered a campaign to freeze witnesses, offers to buy silence, legal maneuvers to complicate interviews, a hired private firm to discredit evidence. But the black card, the ledger, and the published paper went further than fear. They created allies. Employees who had been scared found cover in the notoriety of the story. Fear had once been a mutex. Now it was shared, and therefore less effective. Still, the Wongs used violence where they thought it would be most effective, in the half-lit corridors of people who could not publicize everything quickly enough. A volunteer who had helped Gene's team with surveillance calls vanished for 2 days. He emerged with stitches, a wound that smelled of someone else's anger. A warehouse supervisor had his car torched in a way that made the news brief and the message clear. Every strike cost. The city lost quiet men and quiet money. Gene added each to his ledger. Then came the night they took Alexander. He had a panic room, a single-space investment in a family's sense of immovable comfort. It had white walls, a small bathroom, a phone line that would never ring in ways a normal man could accept. He had planned his escape routes in the way men of privilege plan their vacations. Options, safe houses, cards to redeem. Gene's team did not breach a panic room with bludgeons. They breached it with knowledge. Alexander's security had come from other people. A concierge who delivered unauthorized food, a contractor who serviced HVAC, a PR man who texted a schedule. Those people had errands on certain nights, and those nights were traceable. Gene watched patterns and took them. They found Alexander in the room, pale and suddenly very small, knees tucked, the white cushions catching his panic like snow. He had the blank fear of someone who had been taught to buy insulation and was still cold. The men with Gene did not drag him out. They removed him from the room as if he were a sleeping child and placed him in a vehicle that smelled of leather and coffee, a mundane scent that made him feel less theatrical. There was no shouting. There was no breaking of bones. There was the measured cruelty of men who had decided to move slowly through the mind because breaking it would make no one listen. In a converted office on a low floor of a nondescript building, Alexander woke to faces he did not know, and the sound of the city a few blocks away as a dull heartbeat. The room smelled like paper, toner, and the faint citrus of the cleaner someone used to make things feel less clandestine. Jean sat across from him, hands folded, phantom at his feet, a low shadow moving in the margins. "You can get up," Jean said. His voice was that slow pull of tide. "You can run." Alexander laughed, a wet sound. "You can't. Who are you?" "You can call it many things," Jean said. "But names don't matter here. The thing that matters is choice." Alexander's eyes moved, wild in a face unaccustomed to real fear. He scanned for a camera, for the men who would sell him back his dignity for a price, for a lawyer. There was nothing. Jean slid a thin file across the table, a neat package of photographs, wire receipts, payroll stubs, and a voice memo that contained a supervisor's functionary instructions about keeping papers. There were also the café videos, the little clips, framed anew, showing the entitlement of a man who thought the world was his stage. "You know what these are," Jean said. Alexander swallowed. His mouth was dry. He had spent a life in production of image. He had never expected to be the artifact of a new narrative. "You can't," he started. "You can choose 3 things," Jean said. He listed them like a man listing coins on a counter. 1. You can end your life here. It will be quick, and it will hurt certain people less because sometimes removing the instrument of pain seems like mercy. 2. You can testify. Under oath, you can say what you know about how the company used contractors, how they processed payroll, how people vanished or were kept. You can speak into a microphone and tell prosecutors what the accounting hides. Or 3. You can surrender control of certain assets to a foundation that will be set up to support survivors, wages, housing, care, and that surrender will be used as leverage in the court of public accountability. The choices were terrible and moral in different ways. Jean did not offer them lightly. He did not think himself judge or executioner. He thought of cost. He thought of Shayla in a hospital bed, a woman wrapped in bandages and monitors, and he thought of Keisha's hands, calloused and white-knuckled from sleeping on cots. He thought of the courier with the stitches and the driver whose van had been burned. He thought of the ledger lines that had become human blood. Alexander blinked, as if he were trying to hold on to the idea that his world still had edges. He whispered that he would not be able to testify, that his father would never allow it, that he would be ruined. He looked like a man who could not imagine a life without perfume and cameras. Jean did not argue. He slid forward a photograph that had not been in the first file, a picture of a young man wearing a company badge, his head bent over a stack of boxes. The young man's name was on the back, the sort of detail that made things concrete. "That man has kids," Jean said. "He has a mortgage. He has a mother who keeps a window open like a prayer. He is not a line item in your balance sheet. He is a person. Say what you know. Help them get their lives back." There was a silence. Alexander's shoulders shook, the kind of shake that only came from someone who had been made to confront a new ethical grammar. He asked for time. He wanted a lawyer. He said he would never do what Jean asked. They gave him an hour alone and a mirror. Alexander sat in the small space and watched himself as if for the first time. He watched the arrogance in his mouth, the way it had been a practice. And then he called his father. Victor listened to his son's frantic voice and a pattern of small pleadings, and then, the line quieting, he saw the world closing. He called lawyers and board members, but his men were suddenly playing defense against a public that could not be bought away overnight. He could see how his buildings would be open to regulators, and, in those open spaces, people would remember things they had decided to forget. He had built an empire of walls that worked because no one tried every gate. Now men were trying gates. Alexander returned to the room looking thinner. He had not found courage. He had found fear. It is an often short bridge. "All right," he said. The word tasted of coagulated privilege. "What do you need me to say?" He chose testimony. He chose the court instead of blood. He chose to break a bow of silence that had protected his father. He stood before a recorder and told prosecutors what he had seen. The contractors, the men who reported in hushed tones, the signed memos that had been sent to departments that nobody ever read aloud. He spoke about bonuses arbitrarily awarded and payroll processed in cash. He spoke about a culture where boundaries were suggestions. He had to name names. He had to say things that would break his family's narrative. His testimony did not fix everything instantly. It did not bring back nights lost or the time not spent with a sister who had been in hiding, nor did it erase the coma's ache at a hospital bed. But it cracked open a legal pathway. Federal agents used his statements to obtain warrants. They found ledgers in servers that had been believed to be erased. They located rooms with pay stubs stacked like receipts against a system. Victor came under indictment. The morning he was taken out in cuffs, his face was a pale thing under the stadium lights of a story that wanted spectacle. He had been a man who had run the city with a ribbon of influence. He had not been a man who expected the public to unspool his machinations so publicly. There were hearings and long, loud sessions in which men and women who had once been silenced sat in chairs under lights and told prosecutors about the cost of their quiet. Their testimony was exact and already practiced from months of whispers accumulated into resolute declarations. The legal machine found rhythm in the new evidence. The trials were an ugly, necessary theater. Lawyers argued technicalities. Friends who had once ate at the same tables now avoided one another. The stock price fell like a man who had jumped from too high. Shareholders sued for misrepresentation. The city watched the high-rise windows go dark at the edges, where donors had once been certain their names had value. The impact rolled outward. Vendors severed contracts, municipal officials demanded hearings, and a factory that had once been a harmless node in a supply chain became a site of inspections and subpoenas. Shayla finally woke from her coma with the slow, jagged progress of someone climbing stairs that had lost some of their steps. Her memory came in piecemeal, and she held on to the smallnesses. Keisha's voice when visiting, the coffee steam that smelled like normalcy, the scratch of a dog's paw on hospital tile. Her recovery would not be linear. The physical healing was long, the psychological recovery was longer. Jean sat at the end of her bed more than once, fingers folded, speaking in low sentences about next steps and about property, about legal suits, and about the foundation that would be created to help people like them. When the foundation was formed, an assembly of lawyers, social workers, survivors, and a board that insisted on survivors' leadership, Shayla and Kesha were on it. Keisha's presence was a quiet kind of authority. She spoke in precise sentences that had the force of people who had seen and survived. Shayla took a role that fit her temperament. She did not seek to be the loudest voice. She wanted practical things: counseling access, job placement, secure housing, and a program that paired survivors with service animals to help with trauma. Phantom became an emblem in their literature, a shadowed guardian whose amber gaze reported safety. Victor's indictment led to a different kind of accounting. Shares were frozen. Former executives were called to testify. The SEC and federal prosecutors moved methodically and publicly. At the hearings, the Wong's lawyers argued nuance. Prosecutors argued pattern. When the first conviction came, it was not a moment of gloating. It was a legislative hammer that had been slow to fall. Men who had once thought themselves unaccountable felt their edges dull. The public read the transcripts, the quiet, bureaucratic words that had once hidden harm, and the city turned them into a moral curriculum. But Gene paid for the victory. His methods, legal, shadow, sometimes illegal, were not invisible. There were investigators from other departments who began to take interest in how witnesses had been protected and how evidence had been gathered. The same man who had exposed corporate wrongdoings found himself looking at the mirror. The techniques he'd used, the protections he'd bought, the threats that had been made in his name. He had been careful to keep his hands clean in the eyes of law where necessary. He had also kept some fingers in gray areas. When a congressional aide asked pointed questions about how certain evidence had been acquired, Gene felt the familiar ache of moral arithmetic. He had rescued people. He had also endangered others through calculation. The city's gratitude was partial. The law's interest was total. His network lost members to scrutiny. One of his drivers, faithful and battered, was placed under investigation for a road that had been manipulated during a transfer. He was held for questioning for a day and released. But the legal threat was a scar. Gene watched men he cared about become collateral in the same system they had used to fight monsters. He learned that shadows cast long, and the edges of his operations would be examined with surgical curiosity. There were lawsuits claiming coercion, and rightfully so. Victims' advocates argued that the ends did not always justify the means. Gene faced uncomfortable hearings, where he had to explain why evidence had been collected the way it had been, why he had made certain men avail themselves to his pressure. He did not like the questions. He answered in measured sentences that admitted gray without abandoning necessity. He paid fines when required. He had to ask himself whether the ledger of good he had kept outweighed the harm that had happened in the margins. The foundation that rose from the wreckage did what the city had been slow to do. It created a sustainable support network. Shayla oversaw a program that taught financial literacy to survivors and advocated for policy changes in the city's labor laws. Keisha worked with legislators to change the way complaints were handled, pushing for protections that prevented ID confiscation and required proof of legal representation when a worker's documentation was being held. Phantom was present at the opening of the first survivor-run café, an idea that had begun as a joke and became restitution. Workers from the factory, those who could, bought shares and took responsibility for the place that had once been a site of humiliation. The café was modest, chipped counters, real espresso machines, a staff that wore its small pride like a badge. The coffee was good because the people who made it had something to prove to themselves. The headline that had started the chain, "Billionaire's son humiliates waitress, didn't notice the Korean Mafia boss watching," was reprinted above the menu as a bitter joke and a history lesson. It was framed not as triumph, but as memory, a warning against indifference. Jean watched the café from a distance at first, then from a booth with murmured affection. The sight of the workers behind the counter, moving with authority, felt to him like the careful closing of a circle. He did not pretend it absolved him. He did not expect forgiveness. He had done things that sat like stones in his chest. He had also helped people build a place where no one could be laughed at into a filmy camera for sport. There was justice in that microeconomy. There was also a cost measured in personal distance. Jean found himself less able to lean on friendship. His colleagues trusted him because his decisions were decisive, and they feared him because those decisions sometimes cut the wrong way. Melissa and he had grown closer in the work, but there were nights when she left his office with a look that mixed gratitude with the exhaustion of someone who had seen the price of stories. She wrote a piece about the consequences of extrajudicial methods in which she named the dilemma without naming him. It was careful and tender and public in ways that made Jean uneasy. He read it twice and then folded it and kept the fold. As the city adjusted, as the legal fallout followed its slow but certain trail, Victor was sentenced. There was no scene of poetic justice. The judge issued a measured decision backed by thick volumes of deposition and ledger slips. Victor's asset portfolio was frozen. He was ordered to restitution where possible. The firm he had built collapsed into smaller entities and was pried open by regulators like a watch that needed cleaning. Men who had once worn his favor like armor found themselves negotiating deals with prosecutors. The system worked in its way, late, clumsy, but real. Alexander, after testifying, lived on a reduced public plane. He was not forgiven. He paid fines and did public apologies that had a shape like rituals. He worked with the foundation for a while, awkwardly and with the clear discomfort of someone learning how not to be the center of attention. He signed documents that surrendered certain assets. The money that flowed into the foundation was not enough to heal everything, but it paid for clinics and retraining programs. It built a small archive to store the ledgers and the files that told what had happened, so that no future generation could claim ignorance. Shayla became an unlikely symbol, not a martyr, not a trophy, but a woman who had been mocked and almost erased, and who now spoke at hearings with a steady voice. She did not crave the spotlight. She used it. She wore comfortable clothes and a soft shirt that had a coffee stain she refused to launder, a small defiance. She worked to keep the foundation survivor-led, fighting both for compensation and for structural change to prevent the exploitation that had fed the Wong machine. Jean never moved entirely into the light. His organization took steps to formalize. He hired legitimate counsel, set up a nonprofit arm to manage funds, and signed off on audits when required. He taught others how to protect witnesses without becoming predators themselves. He put men and women in positions where his past methods could be scrutinized and policed. He knew the danger of becoming his own tribunal. He also knew that the city would always need people who could see the dark and point a finger where legal eyes might not yet turn. In the quieter moments he thought of his father, of factories and bent backs and the long ledger of absence, and he wondered whether his life had been an answer or a repetition. He felt the weight of people whose lives had tangled with his. He had saved some. He had also asked others to do things he would rather not have asked. In the ledger in his head, he wrote both columns, benefit and cost. They often did not balance. When the formal chapter closed, prosecutions finished, a few convicted, some settlements reached, Jean walked back to the cafe where it had begun. He passed the window and saw the new staff, the worker owners, laughing in ways that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with survival. Phantom sat near the entrance, old now but still alert, a living emblem that made people slow for a second. Gene slipped into a corner booth and ordered a coffee. He paid cash. A tourist took a photograph of the plaque on the wall, and a barista said to her lightly, "This place used to be a stage for something ugly." The tourist frowned at the story, and then nodded, because public memory is a complicated thing. Gene sipped his coffee. It was bitter and real. The headline that had catapulted the chain of events, "Billionaire's son humiliates waitress," didn't notice the Korean Mafia boss watching, hung in his mind like a folded page. He had become visible by choice once. He had stepped into a spotlight, because if he didn't, someone else would have continued to be burned. He had used shadow and light, pressure and law. He had not always been clean, and the law had asked questions. That left him with a kind of peace that tasted like uncompensated cost. He was a guardian of a sort, but one who had learned that guardianship often smells of old leather and dirty hands. On the wall of the café, a small sign listed the foundation's mission: support for survivors of labor abuse, legal advocacy, job training, mental health services, support animals. Underneath, in a font less bold, it read, "Built by those who survived, run by those who know." Gene thought of the survivors' faces he had seen, their fatigue and sudden, rare smiles, and he felt that the ledger was not just about numbers. It was about small restorations that could be scaled into systemic change. He stood to leave. Shayla and Keisha were behind the counter, exchanging a joke about a morning rush and a burnt espresso. Keisha saw him and nodded. Shayla gave him the same steady look she had given him months before in the street. Thanks, and a warning that this was not over. He nodded back and pushed open the door into a city that had been changed by the slow, dirty work of exposure and consequence. Outside, Phantom nosed the air and bounded a little, the way older dogs do when a possibility flowers for a second. Gene let the moment be small and then stepped back into the current of the city. He would keep working, now with stricter lines and more public oversight. He would answer questions about methods and pay for mistakes. He would also continue to be the kind of person who watched and intervened in ways the law could not always immediately sanction. It was a compromise that would always feel like an incomplete apology. The irony of it lingered. The man painted in a headline as the Korean Mafia boss had never wanted that title. He had wanted to be a man who made sure the powerless were less powerless. The city had given him a different name. He would live with it, and with the costs it implied. He walked away from the café, Phantom at his heel. The city spread out, facades and alleys, windows and hollows, each one a potential story. Gene kept his hands in his pockets, feeling the familiar weight of obligations and debts. He would build formal protections, he would advocate for law change, and he would, when absolutely necessary, step into shadow. He would do so knowing that every compromise carried a bill. The story that began with a cup of scalding coffee had ended with a courtroom and a small worker-owned café. The wounds remained. The lawsuits continued to trickle like small streams into the courts. The foundation's work had only just begun. Survivors still had nights they could not sleep, but there was also a network solid enough to hold them while the city learned to look. Gene paused on a bridge and watched the river swallow light. He thought of the ledger one more time. He had taken things that were given as trivial, an apology video, a corporate statement, and turned them into consequences. He had made men like Victor pay in ways that were both legal and terribly human. It was not redemption, it was restitution in the narrow, necessary sense. He lit a cigarette, watched the smoke dissolve, and then put it out. He would not be a savior. He would be the kind of shadow that sometimes held a hand when the light failed. That was all he permitted himself to be. If this story moved you, share it. If only so the powerful know there are more watching than they think.